to In the Shadows, a podcast where we explore scholarship and discuss invisible student populations in higher education. We are your hosts, Yasmin, Erin, and Kate, higher education and student affairs professionals in California. We are also graduate students in the Higher Education Administration and Leadership program at Fresno State. Join us in this episode as we shine light on students in the shadows.
Hello and welcome to another episode of In the Shadows podcast. My name is Erin Connor.
My name is Kate Spencer.
And I'm Yasmin.
And today we are going to be talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion for disabled students. So I'd like to start with a couple things, just kind of some background about disabled students or students with disabilities to get a better understanding of what disability is, the language we use, and then looking at diversity and inclusion of diversity within higher education. So there are two different terms that are used interchangeably in higher education. Students with disabilities, that's a person first or personhood type of language identity. A lot of student affairs professionals will use it because they think it humanizes, they think it puts the student first, which really helps. And then there is also disabled students, which is language first identity. That's starting to be used by disabled students themselves as a way of kind of taking back that identity and recognizing the social construction of disability and emphasizing ableism in society. So when we are talking about disability within this podcast, we will probably be using the two terms interchangeably. I myself identified as a disabled student, and I have struggled for quite a few years in actually saying I am disabled, but I mostly will start referring to it as disabled students. The second thing I want to introduce is a type of post-structural theory called crip theory. It is a post-structural theory that challenges and critiques compulsory able-bodiedness, able-mindedness, and ableism in society. And it's a lens to view the world or even activities within the world. And it's really intricately connected to queer theory, which is another post-structural theory. And one of the reasons it's very connected is queerness used to be associated with deviantness. And so disability and deviance were very interconnected within a historical lens. So those two, while different types of theories, are often used in conjunction with one another. So crip theory is kind of how I view a lot of different things in trying to see, well, how is this this piece of work or documentation or even policy have ableism intertwined in it. So it's just a different way of viewing the world. So the CDC states that about 26% of the population in the United States has at least one documented disability. And in 2009, about 11% of college students had a documented disability. One thing to keep in mind that in order to be included in the students with disabilities is you actually have to report yourself as having a disability. So that 11% could really be underreported because a lot of students who may have a disability may not actually report or request accommodations. Another thing I want to talk about is there's different models or frameworks for disability and understanding what that is. And that can really change how we talk about disabled students and serving disabled students. The biggest one is the biomedical model, or sometimes also called the functional limitations framework. That's the predominant model in both society and still in higher education. It's where disability resides within the person. It's often a very medicalization of the disability as well as dehumanization of the person. It disregards any kind of social or environmental factors that can lead to the disability, and rehabilitation or making so that this person can function within the ableist world is key. And the biomedical model is most recognizing of physical disabilities because there's more than merely physical or mobile um, disabilities. It can also view disability as inferior, and where it really lies in higher education is the accommodations, which is the main way disability exists or is talked about in higher education. And so there's a lot of stereotypes that accommodations for students to make it so that they can actually participate in class lowers academic standards. So there's a lot of stigmatizing of being a disabled person. It's one of the reasons a lot of students don't report having a disability. Another type of framework is the minority model framework, or also called the minority group model. That recognizes that disability is the result of challenges in the environment and society rather than relying within the individual. It recognizes disability as a social identity or a social group, and that identity group experiences marginalization, discrimination, and oppression, including very much like other minorities. And so, while this can be a really great model, it has limitations in that it uses very deficit language, in that it implies that all disabled people are being discriminated against or stigmatized. So it does have a deficit language model, but it can be enlightening in what disability, how that's experienced in the world. Another one is called Social Construction of Disability Framework. And that's kind of the up and running, more liberal idea of disability at this time. And so that framework recognizes that disability is a product of social construction. And it's very transformational in that it celebrates the uniqueness and the disability experiences. It's a model that tries to liberate rather than rehabilitate. And it criticizes ableism, and it challenges our current power structures that result from ableism. And one of the things that I really like about this model is it really encourages disability and liberation of disabled students and accommodations. It's a shared responsibility of all higher education and student affairs professional rather than just the Disability Services Office, which is usually the main place that disability is recognized. Another thing I'd like to point out is disability is a spectrum. So there's great diversity within disability itself. It could be visible, it could be invisible. In fact, only 10% of disabilities are actually something you can see. So most people who have a disability or are disabled, you can't see it just by them walking down the street. Examples include like physical or motor disabilities. That's usually what people associate with disability. Chronic disease or illness that disrupts the life. That also includes mental illness. There can be neurological disability. So it's disability when it's disability in itself just has such a spectrum and diversity within itself. And then another thing I'd want to mention is there are legal protections for people with disabilities, both in the United States and within higher education. The biggest ones are Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. That's a really big act in that it made accommodations required within public entities. And the American Disabilities Act of 1990 required that of all places that received public funding. And so that was a revolutionary act in really opening up access to higher education to students with disabilities. And then in 2008, there were the ADA amendments that made opened up what was considered a disability as well as providing documentation. It made it a little bit easier. So while we are, pretty far from liberating disabled people, These amendments or acts have still been really revolutionary and are considered the civil liberties acts for disabled individuals. So at this point, I'd like to talk about an article that I read that I thought was super interesting. We've all read it, but I'm going to kind of talk about it, and then I think we'll have a discussion about talking about disability being included in diversity and multicultural conversations. In a Inside Higher Ed article, Burke writes about how higher education has been really slow to include disability in diversity and multicultural initiatives, conversations, and programming. Disability has rarely been recognized as an aspect of social identity, and it's not part of our conversations about historically underrepresented and marginalized populations. As I've mentioned, the concept of disability is diverse in itself, and disabilities can be visible or invisible and can intersect with other social identities, such as race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, gender identity, and sexual orientation. Disability conversations most often occur in the context of educational accommodations and federal legal compliance, and it's rarely included in any kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion programming. While disability advocates indicate that education accommodations are extremely important, there is much more to disabled life and the college experience than what happens in the classroom. Disabled students encounter a lot of barriers more than to their success in educational accommodations. And as I've mentioned, they can often experience discrimination and marginalization by their peers, staff, faculty, as well as even accessing services on and off campus. And so the article really indicates that it's rare for diversity recruitment efforts to be included, to include disabled students, faculty, and staff. So large institutions such as the University of California and the California State University systems do indicate that disability is included in their diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And they often cite their large investments in accessible technology. Disability advocates argue that disability is not visibly present in their diversity and multicultural programming. And so disability advocates stress that institutions need to be intentional in their inclusion of disability and diversity initiatives. Universities need to acknowledge the intersectionality of the identities and include disability in diversity and social justice programming. Universities also really need to recognize their history of exclusion and ableism, as well as how disability interacts with racism and the criminal justice system. And so disability and disabled students really need to be more than compliance or legal problems that need to be solved. And their unique perspectives really need to be valued in and outside the classroom. So at this point, I would like to open up to my co-host for us to kind of discuss what I've talked about, if you have any questions, and we can go from there.
Thank you, Erin, for all of that great information. I think it's going to be helpful in as we go on today in our conversations, as well as our listeners, and being able to get a little bit more insight of all of the language that's being used around the student population, ensuring that we're not using deficit language when we're talking about the student population. I know that you mentioned in your research that there's and you've touched bases on this, but I'm very I love listening to real stories, and I'm like a story person. In any of your research, or perhaps in your own experience, when you're interacting with student affairs professionals, or even colleagues as a staff member now, how do you navigate those negative connotation and those barriers, and what do you feel you need from colleagues, and what or other staff while you're a student to really become an ally in this fight?
Thanks for that question, Yasmin. I definitely don't want while I have experienced being a disabled student, both as a undergraduate student, a graduate student, and now I am a disabled student affairs professional. This is very much a recent development in me claiming that identity. That is something that I have always really kind of rejected because of the stigmas associated with it. I'd say one of the biggest things people can do to be an ally is recognize that disability does exist and to take that into consideration. Because so many students with disabilities, or even staff or faculty members, may not outwardly show a disability, it's very much not part of the conversations. I feel like I have to bring it up all the time. And so I'm kind of known as the disability queen when it comes to that, where I'm always saying, well, what about this? And what about that? And it's not one of the reasons I was really drawn to this article was because I too have been very frustrated that disability is rarely included in conversations about diversity. We had a course about diversity where we did not mention disability at one point. And considering that, at least a tenth of the population that you will be working with on campus, I would presume more, has a disability, I think that's a big gap. And so I think even just recognizing that we need to keep bringing disability up in conversations when we are thinking about access, when we are thinking about inclusion, is really important.
Thank you, Erin. I think you bring a lot to the conversation, especially because you yourself have had the experiences and the conversations. You're kind of living that staff life of having to advocate. I know one thing that kind of really stood out to me based on your research was that 11% of our students are kind of reported as having a disability. But I think for me, I want to emphasize the fact that 11% is underrepresented. And I think this ties back to your previous comment that there's a huge stigma. I mean, you yourself say it. There's a huge stigma about saying, oh, I have a disability and I need that extra help. But then as I'm hearing you talk, and this just kind of came to me, now that you've kind of claimed that identity, I have to ask, maybe not necessarily to you, but to kind of put it out there, maybe that we can all discuss, is then, are we then using that person as like our one token person to be that advocate? Like, I wonder, do we start feeling, or, do those individuals start feeling burnout from having to be like, no, like that's not how it works, or having to be that advocate, whether it's for students, faculty, staff, if it's so underrepresented in that sense, how is that then impacting those individuals who do say that? And so I kind of want to get your guys' thoughts on that. What it was just something that came to me in terms of now playing the advocate role, where how is that now seen by our colleagues?
I can only speak from my own experience. While I say I have claimed that identity, I don't really talk about it at work very much. I'm still very private about different things just because of issues I've had in the past. So a lot of times when I am talking about it, I'm kind of acting like I'm an ally as opposed to part of the population in a professional capacity. Depends on who I'm talking to. Because I still am fearful that people will have negative connotations about me. So while people in my office know I have chronic disease and I have chronic illness, they don't actually know what's wrong with me. And I have never volunteered that information. I'm not required to by law, but I don't volunteer that information because I don't want people to judge me. And I already have people who get angry because I'm out, even though I have you know, FMLA protection. But people, sometimes if they don't understand, they can get very angry, or jealous if they think you're getting special treatment. I think that is part of the thing with accommodations, is it may seem unfair. I think that kind of goes to the conversation about equity as opposed to equality. And so I know that can be hard. But in terms of me, I'm not really burned out talking about it. I do get frustrated that it's not recognized, but for me, it doesn't really bother me bringing it up. But I'm sure other people feel much differently about it. I'm sure it can be exhausting. I also will be honest, I only started really recognizing it as an aspect of my identity within the last few years. And, so for people who have recognized it as a big aspect of their identity or their entire life, they probably feel a lot different.
Yeah, I think, Kate, with your question, it kind of reminds me of conversations that I've had around a different minoritized group. But I think what I heard rings true is that it's not up to those individuals in that group, right? So in this case, a person who's disabled to hold the burden of that. As an ally, you have to hold that burden to go out and find the information. And if you are able to talk with someone who is part of that group, realizing that they don't speak for everybody, that they're only speaking their truth, and being able to recognize that, and knowing that the burden of understanding and the burden of knowledge doesn't reside, or I think that's how you say the word, on that student population, that it really has to be on the ally to go out and look for these resources and read up on it, because like you mentioned, we shouldn't create these unsafe places where individuals are uncomfortable sharing their struggles and being able to tell us that they're going through these struggles, and for us to be able to accommodate them, to be able to find resources for them to be successful.
I know, Yasmin, you bring a really good point. I do want to stress that I totally in agreement with the fact that it the onus is kind of put on those who maybe don't identify or have a disability. Allyship, as we kind of said in some of our other episodes, plays such a huge role in what we do as higher education student affairs professionals. And so it's really important that we stress that we shouldn't have our quote token individuals speaking for it, and it's not their job to teach us. Could they still tell us stuff? Absolutely. But not everything has to be put on their shoulders. That's not fair to them. And so I think it's also really interesting too that we also talk about disability as a spectrum, in that for a while now, and I'll come out there, and it's been years, because I think I've kind of had to teach myself this, is that for me, my first gut feeling when I think of disability is to really go for that physical disability. And it kind of took me a few years to really kind of understand that that's just not the case. There's so much more now, like Erin said. There's how we categorize disability now is so much different compared to how it was before. And I'm curious how you guys think about it, in that I wonder how those with our more invisible disabilities, if I may, kind of still navigate the space that is so, I think, permeated with thoughts of how do we accommodate for physical disabilities. Just kind of throwing it out there.
Yeah, Kate, when you were talking like this, like the picture of the disability sign when you like drive up to like Target or Walmart and like they have, the parking reservations for folks, and it's of a wheelchair, right? Like it's so ingrained into our society that individuals with disabilities have to look that way, have to, be unable to walk or have a physical disability. So I know that I still, when I think of students in this capacity, I have to remind myself that it's not just, that social construct that has been driven into our minds, and being able to like halt myself and say, hey, like that spectrum that you all have brought up, to really think about how how all of those voices need to be captured when bringing them up.
Yeah, I do want to say, like, especially to that, I remember I was with my significant other, and we were at a store, and I actually caught myself doing that. And this was years and years ago. And it was a weird, almost surreal sensation, because I saw someone come out who had a handicap pocket, but they looked fine. And I had made some, you know, not thought through comment. It wasn't bad, but obviously it was like, you have to critically think a little bit here. But I remember she said, like, not everything has to be visible. If you were to look at my dad, who had really bad like heart problems and lung problems, you know, he wouldn't have been able to walk, 5 minutes, 10 minutes at most without having to sit down. And you wouldn't have never guessed that just by looking at him. And I really like to think that that was the point where I'm like, oh, that's a good point that I would have never ever considered. And I think that's part of this section of the conversation of including, some of our more invisible, disabled identities, or um, just stuff that isn't physical that you wouldn't consider it. I think that was kind of my awakening point.
It's part of that like unlearning process, right? Like I think as an ally too, like it's part of that unlearning this like social construct that's been delivered, like Grattan to us, to be able to think about, like, to do a lot of self-reflection and to realize that we have that social construct, um, and how do we start debunkering those ideologies that we've grown up with that continue to be around us all the time.
Thank you. I appreciate those comments. So as we think forward, what can we do better? I really hope that as we consider diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, we start bringing disability into the conversation, and not only visible disabilities, but invisible disabilities, as that is the majority of the students we will be working with will have invisible disabilities. So I really hope that that will be brought into conversations and start being talked about when we are talking about diversity. While race and ethnicity are absolutely important, um, diversity is, I mean, sorry, not diversity. Disability is also a very salient part of identity as well. And also, there's also intersecting identities. A Black woman can also have a disability. So there's lots of different things. It's not a complicated thing. I think sometimes when we do have diversity conversations, they can be very simplified in not understanding that there are so many different aspects to identity and marginalized identities. Some of them are visible, some of them are not, some of them are socioeconomic. It can be like a lot of different things that we can't see by looking at someone. So I just really hope that in future conversations that they can be included. We do have a diversity week coming up at Fresno State. I was very pleased to see that there was one for disability. So that was fantastic. I was super happy about that. I'd say 5 years ago, that probably was not happening. There are some really amazing disability advocates out there. A lot of them are on social media, TikTok, Instagram. They really are sharing their stories in ways that show that disability is not just one specific experience or thing. There are different ways that it interacts. And it also, like I said, it intersects with race and gender as well. A couple things I'd like to talk about is ways that we as student professionals can really try to think about supporting our students with disabilities. One of them is thinking about COVID-19 and how that has affected um, individuals. And one thing that I, as a disabled person, would like to bring up is I've been told for years I could not be accommodated by being able to work remotely or having flexible schedules because that just wouldn't work for the office environment. Well, COVID-19 came around, and all of a sudden I have worked remotely for a year. And it hasn't been everyone's favorite thing. I absolutely love it. I actually work more than when I am in the office, but because of a little bit more flexibility, whether it is in the times of hours I do it, or even being able to be in my pajamas when I'm not feeling well, it's much easier for me to be able to complete those tasks from home. There's some great articles out there about disabled students who um, have different types of disabilities. One had PTSD, another one had severe illness, and they talk about really loving to be able to log into Zoom and still participate in conversations, even when they're not feeling great, or they don't have to worry about having a panic attack because of something, or even having asynchronous classes can be really helpful because, something might come up that specific time they would normally have class, but because they can go in later that day, they can still participate. So I think while COVID-19 has been really, really hard on so many people, and I do think there has definitely been challenges for all students, including disabled students, in getting their accommodations, I think there are some interesting things that have come out of it. And I really hope as we go back to, and I'm putting it in quotes, normal, we can think of ways that we can still accommodate people because we have shown that we can do that. And just because it may not be what we normally did, we should be able to do that. So I'd like to discuss that as well.
Yeah, no, Erin, you bring up a really good point. COVID-19 has always been an interesting topic, just as now we're past the 1 year mark, and it's crazy to even think that we've been doing this for a year. But also the fact that I've also heard similar conversations from people who were like, "Oh, yeah, we can't be accommodating and let you work from home, or do what you got to do." And then all of a sudden, we're all required to work from home, and now it's feasible. And so gosh, I wish I could remember the term for it, but it just so happens when it benefits the majority group that now all of a sudden it's going to start working for everyone. And it really begs the question. It's like, well, what was the real reason why you didn't want to do it before? um, and I just think back to, one of the opportunities we had within our course over this last semester, where we had somebody come from our local, counseling and health services. And they were mentioning that once they went, remote because of the pandemic, um, how they had to, provide their services, not just in person, but they had to do it via Zoom because COVID-19. So it was interesting to see that, while I think some people still do prefer the in-person opportunity to go talk to some of our counselors, and I think that might just be because there might be a lot more privacy than if they were at home. You nobody's going to be listening in. But at the same time, I remember our presenter did mention that there are some people who literally cannot get out of bed to even come to one of the counseling sessions. And so I think when we talk about, students with disabilities, I think that's opened up such a big avenue in making sure that we are providing that extra support for students who, like some just can't make it for whatever reason. I think it's interesting that COVID-19 really has opened up a lot of great opportunities for us to change how we provide services. And like you said, that's really weird coming from the fact that we're talking about, a pandemic. And so I really like that you made note of that we're kind of now forced to think of how we operate.
Yeah, I think it's also, I've heard from colleagues in advising units too, where students, now I don't know if these students identify as part of this group, but in my conversations with these colleagues, they've seen that more students are able to actually attend their office hours because, some students don't live on campus, and just getting to campus can be very difficult. So I know that on my campus, we've started to have, and I'm not part of this group, but I know that there's a group on the university that I work in, to talk about and have conversations about what it's going to look like for students and staff and faculty once we're back on campus. And it'd be interesting to, those conversations will get like dispersed into smaller units. And I think, and I'm thankful that you brought up this question too, because then when I have conversations with my team to really think about like, can we create a hybrid of what currently we have now during COVID, because we had to, and we've seen that it works for students, so that I think a lot of it's like, oh, we haven't done it before and now we have, but we need to go back to normal. And it's like, or normal in quotations, and really pushing back on that idea and saying, hey, like, we need to ensure that maybe we need to create this like hybrid method of providing services for our students, and what is that gonna look like for us and for them. And it kind of also brings me back to our conversation that we had with Brandy, and this in her findings, how you need like buy-in, right, from whomever. And so it's important too to, I think, I don't know how, possibly to, I think students are tired of getting like, fill out this survey regarding COVID and things like that. But a lot of those surveys have been like, what's negatively impacted you about COVID, and not really like what has worked as we work remotely, as you take courses remotely. Like, we've heard it, like we've heard it from Erin, we've heard it from the counseling center, but there's, I think, like, to get this like buy-in, we need that data, because I think, and I've heard this over the years, like data and numbers is what gonna get buy-in. And so we really need to, like, I don't know, I know students and I know myself, like, it's tiring to do a survey, but I think it will help push that like hybrid notion of like, what has worked in COVID and what do we need to do in order to facilitate those services to these students. I think is like a really complicated answer to the question, but I think we need to have like that buy-in because otherwise I don't think it's going to happen. And it's sad, like it breaks my heart even saying that. But it's always like that, those idea of like, we need like evidence to support creating a hybrid of services. Yeah, so it's like a frustrating point, right?
Yes, I agree, Yasmin. I have great concerns, not just for disabled students, but just in general. When people keep saying, I want to go back to normal, I want to go back to normal. And I say that too, but I'm like, normal really didn't work for a lot of people. So we do need to really look at what is really truly working. I know some people really hate online classes and they hate Zoom and they hate all of that, but not everyone does. I think it's assumed that everyone hates it. But I have really, because I work with students every day as a financial aid counselor, I talk a lot on the phones. Some of them really like it. A lot of them are older, so it's because it fits better in their schedule. They're working. So it's been really good for them. I can definitely see, as maybe, I'm going to put it in quotes, the traditional 18 to 22-year-old undergrad experience. I don't think I necessarily would have liked it myself. I think it depends on what type of work you're doing. I was a performing arts student, so online Zoom really wouldn't have been great. But I do think we really need to look at critically what is working, and maybe while it works for some people, it may not work for others. And is there a way we can find a way to create a sustainable hybrid model? We're talking about going back into the office to work, and people have brought up, not just me, what are the options for working remotely after this? Are we all going to be returning? And the concern has been like, well, how do we make it fair? If one person can work remote, how do we do that for another? So I think it comes back to the equality versus equity issue as well. What does that mean? What is fair? Does a person need this? Does a person want this? And I think another thing to think about is the concept of universal design, both for universal instruction design and maybe universal design in terms of like work. Sometimes I think we think, well, it's such a small population. We don't really need to do all this work to just accommodate a very small population. But maybe it benefits everyone. So, and I think COVID-19 in some ways showed that about certain aspects. Students being able to do counseling sessions from Zoom at home. Maybe I don't think it's only benefiting students who have disabilities or even students with serious mental health issues. Maybe they like it because they can do it really quick and go back to work, or they can do it really quickly and do something else. I mean, I think there are great benefits of Zoom counseling and Zoom medical appointments. I'm often able to squeeze them in between other things I'm doing without having to take an hour and a half to 3 hours to leave to wait in the office to do that sort of thing. I think it doesn't necessarily just mean just because a person is disabled they need it. I think universal design can really be beneficial for so many people. And it also doesn't leave the onus on the student identifying themselves and having the medical documentation that they have a disability, because that's what they need when they enter schools. They have to have documentation, which can be difficult to obtain. And that is, we put it on the onus of students with disabilities to ask for permission to participate rather than being able to participate freely. Another thing to remember is when we are asking for accommodations, it is at the discretion of the faculty member and what they term or deem as reasonable. What does that mean? There's a lot of issues with faculty determining, no, I'm not going to do that. And they have the right to do that. They can say it's unreasonable. I have talked to students who have had to drop courses due to failure to have their accommodations approved. And so they've had to drop the course because they're like, there's no way I can do this. And it affects them, like, in terms of reaching their degree, it affects their financial aid, affects a lot of things. So it's very complicated.
Yeah, I think, Erin, you bring up a really good point in with regards to, especially in classrooms where, especially now that, we are Zooming essentially, there has to be a little bit of wiggle room, for lack of better terms. Um, and I think that's where, going back to previous conversations, that's where the allyship comes in. Um, Being able to point out and say, this is what the issue is. And one thing that I've been thinking about as we kind of gotten onto this topic is when we do go back to normal, quote unquote normal, I think it would be so irresponsible of, I think, any institution personally to then put all of that on, say, our, services for students with disabilities offices, or just our, health and counseling centers. I think there is a lot more that can be done in terms of partnerships too. I'm very much a big collaborator, and I think that's just kind of based on the work that I do, because um, I come from the fundraising sector, and literally you have to make friends with everyone. But there's a benefit to that. Erin, like you said, at Fresno State, we have Diversity Week coming up, and this is the first time we're seeing, disability on it. Imagine that partnership coming through and really, you know, coming to fruition, and we're seeing something, and we're hoping that more like it comes. But how would that even look like to see it within specific colleges or in other functional areas under student affairs? And so I think it would be irresponsible, just kind of how there's some critique on putting, you know multicultural educational work on, our cultural centers. I think the same could go for um the services for students with disabilities. I would argue that same thing. Just having a small office is going to cause a lot of burnout. And how does that then go ahead and impact students as well? So I think when we start talking about changing our procedures and changing how things are done, especially on an institutional level, which then encompasses our colleges or schools, that sort of stuff, um, I think more can be done rather than just having one office do it. And I think that's important to keep in mind too when we think about how are we expanding this work and really gaining allyship for these students.
I agree, Kate. And also, I really do believe in the good of people. I think most people on campus, they want students to succeed. I said that a lot. They want students to succeed. I think a lot of them would be really open to supporting students with disabilities, but maybe they don't have the education that we have so many students who have disabilities on campus. Maybe they think that unless you're in a wheelchair, you're fine. You don't have any kind of disability. So I really do think that most higher education professionals and student affairs professionals truly care. And I think there needs to be some institutional wide or even system wide, depending on what it is, kind of education so that we're aware that there are these issues. I mean, I bring this up because I'm not sure in current student affairs programs or higher education programs, is disability included in the conversations they're having in these 2 to 3 year programs? Are they included in PhD and EDD programs? Maybe they are. But if they're not, these are the educated professionals that are going to be going out and becoming leaders, and they need to have that education in order to be able to share it and bring it about. So I think it needs to be a multi-initiative instance. I don't think it's one person's responsibility, but I also think that most people really do care and do want to help.
Yeah, Erin, that's a great point. And I think I can only speak for myself as someone who doesn't identify as part of this group, that I care, but sometimes I'm scared that I'm going to overstep on their voices, and I don't want to do that because they're more than capable to be able to voice their concerns. And also, I don't want to say something that, is so hurtful and painful because I'm not well versed in the barriers that they're going through or understanding their lived experiences. And so I've, participated in a lot of diversity trainings because I want to become more aware of, issues. And I think as you were talking, Erin, I was like, none of these diversity trainings that I've been to on either campuses that I'm involved in have talked about individuals with disabilities and how to interact um, with the conversation and being able to, be an ally and what that looks like for that group of individuals. And so I think it stems to, at least for me, of like, one, I need to educate myself a lot more, and two, as I educate myself more, I think I'm going to become more comfortable in voicing and being more vocal of being an ally. And not that I'm trying to like hide myself to be an ally, but more of, I just don't want to say something in a room where I hold an important role or and say something that's inaccurate because I don't have the information. And so I think for me to be an ally, like, I really need to, continue the work that I'm doing now, and reading research and reading articles that talk about these groups and being able to lead those conversations, or perhaps not lead those conversations more sake, but if I ever have the opportunity to sit in a table or a conversation where change is being enacted, to bring those struggles and barriers that students with disabilities face into that conversation.
Thank you, Yasmin. I think one of the things that can make it really hard when talking about disability is because it is such a wide spectrum, and there are a multitude different of disabilities that may have different barriers. I think people who are disabled can share some common experiences in terms of maybe marginalization or stigma, being stigmatized. But I think some of their barriers are different. The accommodations are very unique to the individual. And so that can make it very difficult to know exactly what to say. Um, again, I'm only speaking for myself, Yasmin, but I think I would rather someone recognize that I exist and maybe make a mistake in what they're saying, and then being open to be like, oh, hey, that's a little offensive because of XYZ, and that person be opening into it. I think on the flip side, disabled people, we need to offer some grace as people learn. Because again, some people are ill-intentioned, but I don't think most people are. I think most people are trying, and if they're open to like, hey, that was offensive for X-ray, I would appreciate you didn't say that. And if that person's like, oh, okay, I'm sorry, I think it's kind of like maybe messing up someone's pronouns. A lot of people don't do it intentionally. It's just they may not know and they're like, oh, I'm sorry, okay. And then they correct themselves. I think we need to offer some grace if people are open to change and wanting to learn. So while I really appreciate that you want to get it correct and you want to be, you don't want to overshadow, I think even just, if you're in the room where something like, have we thought about XYZ population? I think that's super helpful because a lot of times people just don't think about it. That's the hard part about being invisible. That's the hard part of, like, we've talked about in our whole podcast is about invisible populations, is people just, because they're not sitting right in front of them and they can't see that they're that particular identity, they just forget. And so I think even being recognized is a great thing.
Thank you, Erin. I think it kind of helps too to like realize that it's a learning process, and along the learning process, like, you're going to make mistakes, but owning up to them and saying, I know that wasn't my intention, but it made you feel like that, and I'm sorry that I made you feel that way, and I'll do better, and I will learn, and I will continue to learn. So thank you, Erin. I think it kind of eases my mind a little bit to know that it's a learning process, and I have to be able to be okay with making a mistake, but knowing that I have to own up to it if I say something that I might not have said it in a malice way, and understanding that the language that I use is not the right or correct way. It made someone feel uncomfortable.
And I think the thing to also remember is language is always changing. Our concepts of existence is always changing. What one person may like, another person may not like. Someone may not like being called disabled. They may think that's super insulting. I think that's one of the reasons people who don't identify with the disabled community tend to say person with disability or students with disability. I 100% understand that. It's kind of like when students part of the LGBTQ plus community would refer to themselves as queer. Because I am not part of the queer community. I was very uncomfortable using that term because I was really worried it may come off as offensive. Well, now it's been about 20 years since people have been using that term, so I'm fairly comfortable using it. But, a lot of it was, I was like, well, I just don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. I don't want them to think I'm trying to insult them or say anything. So I think that's part of language changing, and when a population reclaims language and how that might mean. Well, I thank you both for joining us to talk about this really important student population. I hope we've learned something. For our listeners, I will have a resource list that I think has really important information about disability as a concept and serving disabled students. So if you're interested, please check out our website for more information. And thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to In the Shadows, a higher education podcast. We are your hosts, Yasmin, Erin, and Kate. We hope you enjoyed today's episode and will join us for future episodes. Clear Day, royalty-free music, is provided by Bensound. Visit them at www.bensound.com. Please visit our website at intheshadowspodcast.weebly.com to review the literature and resources discussed on today's episode. Please share any feedback or ask questions by emailing us at intheshadowsinfo@gmail.com.